pictures of people from different social strata to volunteers while measuring brain activity. The researchers found that this area of the brain was less active when volunteers looked at a homeless person, as opposed to a professional athlete or a doctor or lawyer, and commented, quote, "It's as though the person was more like an object," in terms of the scans of the brain. Now, when Eagleman considered this study and his own experiments related to the neurology of empathy, he saw a chilling link to the history of genocide. Genocide is only possible, he says, when dehumanization happens on a massive scale. So this is why I see it as a primary role of an interfaith leader to confront every form of polarization and to interrupt and call out distortions that come about through this dehumanizing rhetoric. Finally, the last point I want to make is, and that I think is really important in this context where Ibu brought up this point about politics and thinking about the polarization in our political discourse. This is not an exclusive tool of the political left or right. For example, in 2016, Representative Hank Johnson, a Democrat, compared Jewish people to termites. Michael Flynn, a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General and may surprise some of you, a registered Democrat who had a short-lived appointment as the National Security Advisor in the current Republican administration, has described Islam as a cancer. It's easy to slip from disagreeing with a policy or a practice to demonizing a people. And this is the line that we must notice and refuse to cross, and call out when it is crossed. Given this, I think it's incumbent that we do this work, that we approach interfaith leadership in ways that does not create new lines of polarization and new openings for dehumanizing rhetoric. The next obvious question, of course, is how do we do this? You see, I didn't leave very much time to answer that next question. Because I think it's a question, in part, that we need to each answer for ourselves, depending on the goals and contexts of what we're doing, and that each of us on this panel might answer slightly differently. For me as an educator, one answer is that I tend to privilege relational models of teaching and learning, like small group discussions, site visits, storytelling, the Pluralism Project's case studies, and other what I would call humanizing pedagogies. This is also why I've put a lot of energy into field building work. Interreligious or interfaith studies, I would argue, is fundamentally relational on multiple levels. With its emphasis on dismantling stereotypes, building authentic relationships across lines of difference, highlighting moments of interreligious cooperation, and building an appreciative understanding of diverse traditions, it offers tools and strategies for rejecting polarizing rhetoric or simplistic reductionism, and contributing to an inclusive national ethos that is sorely needed at this moment. Thanks.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and with colleagues, friends, and mentors. In my allotted time, what I'd like to do is share with you personally and professionally my own journey, both as an activist and an educator over the last 2+ years. And through these anecdotes, I think you'll see that many of the theoretical points that were raised by Ibu and Jenny will be crystallized in the stories. And I'm particularly interested in sharing these anecdotes as a way of trying to better understand, to think out loud with friends and colleagues and dialogue partners, the relationship that I am trying to develop internally, both as an activist and an educator, a rabbi that works in both spheres. I want to start with a brief story that some of you know, but I hope it will be helpful in framing my comments. About a decade ago, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization was in the midst of helping to win a great victory in the Commonwealth for those uninsured. And as you might recall, thousands of people through the work of GBIO and many other organizations were eventually provided with medical insurance. And just in the midst of that campaign, the Same-Sex Marriage Act came up in the Commonwealth. And leaders of that organization literally, some of them may be in this room, found themselves on opposite sides of the picket lines and making statements publicly, both in the media and to governmental officials, about their faith-based and ethical reasons for choosing one side or the other. In the midst of that tension, several leaders from GBIO decided that among the things that they needed to do in order to maintain both the coalition and, as they put it, the community that is and was GBIO, they needed to meet in small groups so that people could share their stories, their hopes, their dreams, and their fears. And in one such meeting, Reverend Herman Hamilton was invited by the rabbis from Temple Israel to hear the stories of members of this Jewish community, mostly progressive, several of whom identified as LGBTQ or were a part of families and communities in which that was the norm. At the end of the evening, after people shared stories and there was discussion, Reverend Hamilton said to the assembled group, "When I walked in here this evening, I felt as if there was a brick wall separating you and me. And now when I leave, I feel as if there is a glass pane." And I think it's a very astute insight and something that we need to keep in mind, which is to say, at the end of that evening, Reverend Hamilton and the assembled group did not agree. But what they could do is actually see each other, which is part of why the metaphor is so powerful, and hear each other. And remember, too, that there were reasons why they were also a part of the same coalition and the same community, even as on this very important issue, they were divided. And I know from the leaders of that organization that they didn't resolve the matter, but there was a new discourse that emerged. One, simply put, that was more humane. I want to fast forward several years to the text you have in front of you. Sunday, December 11th, 2016, I had the privilege of participating in an event that was sponsored by GBIO and other local organizations. And it came together very quickly because in the wake of the election, so many people felt polarized, felt like they were misunderstood, devalued, etc. And the reason that we were able, through GBIO and other organizations, to gather thousands of people at the ISBCC for an evening program that involved a series of prayers and conversation pieces is because of the relationships that had been established over those many years, including issues that were very difficult at times to face. I want to read you two excerpts from this piece that you have at the bottom of page 1. In crafting the statement, which I was ultimately responsible for in relationship to a committee, so you can imagine that was quite a task, the words dignity and diligence were very important. You notice that the title is Out of Many One, and then dignity and diligence. And this is what we tried to articulate, imperfectly to be sure. The second paragraph. First, we must find concrete ways for individuals from different segments of society, Democrats and Republicans, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, urban and rural, citizen and new immigrant, to engage each other respectfully, sharing hopes and fears and working collectively to realize our common values and ideals. I want to read you a segment from the next section, which is the diligence paragraph. We stand firmly against all forms of bigotry and bullying in our homes, schools, houses of worship, and civic and political organizations. The quality of our democracy depends on this, that the rights and freedoms of minorities and those marginalized are safeguarded and honored. And to me, this has been an essential tension since the beginning of the Trump administration, and one, of course, that preceded it, but has been intensified, which is to say, how do we at once walk through the world with a sense of dignity, understanding that we need each other across many differences, and at the same time also insisting that there are values that require resilience, and that may end up leading me to one side of the picket line and Jenny on the other. Probably not, in actuality. Which harkens back to Ibu's question about who's at the table. But that is the reality. And sometimes in my own language, in my own groping, I talk about my struggle as a progressive and a pluralist, and how to go about being a human being, a mensch, and a rabbi, and an activist, and an educator with these sensibilities in mind. I want to share with you, if you flip the page, just two concrete examples of the ways in which I've been trying with colleagues to walk this tightrope, if you will. The first is that just a few weeks ago at Hebrew College, in our annual winter seminar, we chose the topic of religious leadership in public life, balancing pluralism, justice, and personal integrity. And that was born out of the social, political, religious moment, and it was born out of this experience with GBIO. That is to say, as I mentioned at the outset, how do I bring my experiences from GBIO back into the training of rabbis and other religious leaders to be? Because as these fields emerge, I'm looking for best practices. I'm hoping to develop a language of discourse. I'm trying to understand better what should a rabbi know vis-a-vis interreligious leadership. What should he or she experience? With whom should they be in conversation? And so you just see some of the highlights from the seminar, which are many of the questions concretized that Ibu outlined so beautifully. Intersectionality, history and contemporary reflections, dialogue training on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Intra-religious discourse, as you well know, can sometimes be just as heated or more so than interfaith or interreligious conversation. Changing the world from the inside out, which is to say, in a rabbinical school context, what does all of this work have to do with midot, with ethical, spiritual attributes, dispositions? What are the dispositions that we want to cultivate? The other thing that I want to make mention of, which was just affirmed today, voted on by the board of the Boston Theological Institute, again, which is an outgrowth of a decade of work, but the last 2 years, frankly, is the introduction of a certificate for students in theological schools in the area. And if you look at what we're of core courses that we're going to ask of students to take, but in addition to develop relationships with mentors in the field. I want people to spend time with Ibu or Diana or Jenny and ask them, how did you arrive at doing this work? And what work is there for us? Because this field is still young and burgeoning. And what might be the best ways both to add to existing initiatives, but also to create the next Pluralism Project or IFYC. And so these are concrete manifestations in this age of polarization, but also an age of opportunity, as I'm experiencing it, to live into the questions both that Ibu and Jenny posed. Thank you.
not going to speak very long because we certainly have a room full of people who must be full of questions and experiences as well. But I do want to respond a bit to the question of the age of polarization and ask a broader question: is this really an age of polarization, or is it an age in which we see the incipient birth of a real pluralism? And I ask that because we know all about the polarization. We see it. It's advertised on television practically every night. And when things happen, we do hear about them. And a lot of things do happen. What we don't hear about as often is the resilience. I mean, there was a little bit of a sort of wave of excitement when the GBIO meeting took place at the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center in December of 2016. How often are those events, are those very, very widespread kinds of comings together, how often are those recognized as part of what is the zeitgeist of our age as well? And can that particular hope that is garnered from all of this experience steer us in a direction that takes public account of what it is that's happened? Now, I want to go back. Eboo has posed an important challenge to us, and that is, how do we think about those two big interfaith manifestations on January 27th in 2017? And we might add another manifestation to that, the one that took place on January 21st, 2017, which was the Women's March all over the country, the people who came together women and men both, but to say something important about the direction that they wanted to see our nation go. And knowing what I saw in Boston, it was not multi-religious. It was multi-religious in its own way. There were people from across the spectrum. There were interfaith and intercultural communities from Medford and Winchester and all around the Boston suburbs. So it was a major manifestation of a spirit in Boston that is important to recognize. And as we know from the way in which that was covered, that was a major manifestation all over the country. And we probably saw a little bit of the same thing as kids from various, high school kids and elsewhere, from various backgrounds came together to say publicly together their opposition to the free and seemingly unrestrained sale of guns. So there is a lot of comings together, and we know perfectly well that they are across lines of background and difference, and unquestionably faith as well. So I think the question is really an important one. How do people who connect their faith and some public issue come together? And what are we who are thinking about interfaith in our society? What are we thinking about that? How can we study and understand some of the ways in which people come together? And among the things I would like to sort of think about here is that there are a range of ways in which, when we delve into the values that sustain us, that we have to analyze how they go together. When we're thinking about certain kinds of issues, there are constitutional and civic covenants that we have as citizens that make a difference. And we need to reference those and think about them. It's not only the courts that think about the values that are civic and constitutional. It is we, the people, as well, who hold these values and think about what it is in those values that would lead us to a particular position on life, on pro-life, on gun control, on the ban of Muslims from our shores. Where are there laws here? And how do we think about them, and how might, as citizens, we change them? The other piece of it, though, is the way in which we value things as people of faith. If we are people of faith, and many are, whether as Muslims or Hindus or Jews or Christians, that's another set of values that does not entirely overlap with our civic values. And we need to be pretty clear about when it is that what we're really standing up for is our values as Christians, and when we're standing up for those fundaments that we hold together as citizens of the United States. And then there's a further nuance that I feel is important to add here, and that is, what is it that we can learn as students, as scholars, as people who in a university are committed to an intellectual investigation? And all of our speakers have indicated that there are things we can learn, that this is a field that we need to study, that is not somehow something that is out there, for the people who are in churches or synagogues or Islamic centers and whatnot. This is actually a field of study that needs to be taken into the center of a scholarly enterprise. And Jenny has been very involved in that, and so has Ibu. Actually, all of us have, in one way or another, saying, we need to study this. We need to study the connections and the disconnections. We can't just be people who are studying, Islam here and South Asia over here, or American religious history somewhere. But this is actually a field of study that is taking as its most important focus these very places where people are connecting or misconnecting. And I want to say again that issue of polarization and the very easy slippage from a polarization to a demonization that you've articulated for us, Jenny, is extremely important. And it's important to look at it carefully when it happens and to make that known, because we can see when it happens. We can see the way in which, a film about Islam, this is years ago, that was sort of tucked into the Sunday newspapers all over the country, slipped very gently from being about Islam and about Muslims who were not the sort of peaceful kind of Muslims to being about Islam in general. And the analysis of this does require people who are dedicated to wanting to analyze the discourse that we have. And finally, I would just ask the question, who are our interfaith leaders? Because we do have lots of interfaith initiatives and organizations and sort of ephemeral and long-term ways of coming together. There are lots of these on college campuses, including our own, including your own. So, and beyond, who are the people who are our interfaith leaders, who are actually providing some of the rhetoric and leadership for a different way of looking at our society? And when I think of that, I do think of some of the protagonists in our case studies who are civic leaders, yes, but they're heads of corporations, they're mayors, they're involved as principals of schools and whatnot. And it's that kind of leadership that also needs to be cultivated. Cultivated because the people who actually shape some of the decisions that are shaping our wider society are in these positions of civic leadership, sometimes without very much of the interfaith skills that Ibu so wonderfully outlines in his interfaith triangle. I think I may not have all of the... What?
So happy.
Yes.
My staff doesn't know about
Yeah, oh, of course they do. So you can ask him about that. But it involves knowledge, it involves relationships, and it involves, what's the A? Attitudes. Attitudes that come out of your background or out of your neurological structures. So I want to stop here and say, I think we have raised, with these wonderful contributors this afternoon, some of the issues that are important for all of us to talk about. And I kind of wanted to begin with a couple of the people who are here from the Interfaith Forum at Harvard and students. Let's start with the people who matter here, and ask Julia and Benjamin, Julia Henry and Benjamin Schaefer. I don't know who wants to go first, but I think our question is, what is most important to you about interfaith work, about the interfaith work that you do and would like to see done? So we'll just start from there, and then we'll open it up for questions, comments, and thoughts from the rest of you.
Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm Julia, I'm Vice President of Harvard Interfaith Forum. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College, 19 years old, so way less articulate and have many years less experience than the incredible people standing next to me. But Professor Eck, she was my professor last semester, so I'll call her that, poses this great question of what is the most important part of what we do. I mean, the Harvard Interfaith Forum was only started 6 years ago, and kind of is totally evolving as we go on this journey of how do we create interfaith work at Harvard. And it's hard to quantify exactly what is the most important part of what we do. And I think it was touched on by some of our panelists, where these relationships that are formed, I think, is how we actually get past this idea of polarization and dehumanization, because once you form a relationship with someone, suddenly your understanding of their entire background and their experience entirely changes. And once that changes, then we can go past that. And once understanding develops, we can move from religious diversity to religious pluralism, which Professor Eck loves to talk about. And if you know, religious pluralism is entirely different. And that's how we move forward, I think, away from this idea of polarization, dehumanization. So I really echo, I think, what was said about that. And I think the Harvard Interfaith Forum within Harvard's campus, and I think a lot of college campuses have similar organizations where we attempt to take a second to breathe, where Harvard is an extremely busy place. Students are just constantly running around. So we try to create spaces where we actually have a chance to talk about life and talk about these bigger problems of essence and being. And instead of just going from thing to thing and class to class, we talk about oh, what is really going on? And how do we feel about that, and how are we gonna change it? And how do we actually stop and create those interpersonal relationships that hopefully then last way past our 4 years here? So I think that is the most important part of interfaith work for me, and hopefully for the Interfaith Forum here. And I think it really just lines up so well with what was being said about how do we bring that out into the world.
Thank you, Julia. Ben, you want to take over here?
Thank you. Just as a similar introduction, my name is Benjamin Schaefer, and I have the honor of serving as the president of the Harvard College Interfaith Forum for the 2018 calendar year. Thank you so much for including us in this. And also, Ibu, I was sitting in the audience at the Loudermilk Center on January 27, 2017, at the IFYC conference. So I was there for the pushback that you got and your speech, which I thought was incredible. And I think it was a really productive thing because my counterpart and I, who came down, landed at Boston Logan Airport around 11:55 p.m. that night as groups were organizing at Logan Airport to protest what was going on. So we're kindred spirits in that regard. And I think this actually gets to a question of what Rabbi Orr used the metaphor of the bricks to the glass. And then I think the question that Ibu raised was, what do you do with 24 people, and you split that group in half, along lines of extreme, probably, ideological difference. And that's at least where I thought you were going with the question. And I think something that's so important for my conception of interfaith leadership, of interfaith work, is service. Because I think it's easy to host a conversation and say, where do we agree? Awesome, we agree. Let's pat ourselves on our backs for agreeing, affirm that we've agreed, and then set up a meeting to agree again. That's great, but where do we go from there? And I think something that I would like to see the Interfaith Forum do and other interfaith organizing groups on college campuses, but beyond colleges, is acting. And I think that's Ibu, where you were going. And it's so important to say dialogue is great, dialogue is awesome, but there's so much need, and how can we as a collective, even if we don't agree, address that need?
And what do you do when you all get together, the Interfaith Forum? Like, if I were to drop into Interfaith Forum, what would be happening there?
We have, thanks to Professor Eck, we have dinner every other Wednesday night in Lowell House.
You have topics for that dinner?
Yes, yeah.
Such as?
So,
I haven't been, so this is a real question.
Right. So
they used to talk about sex and different perspectives thereon, or that.
Our dinners are often thematic, and sometimes holidays are helpful in planning what we want to talk about. Our Feasting on Faith director is actually here, so he could tell you more about that. But I will say that we talk about anything from interfaith and relationships, both platonic and romantic, to interfaith and gratitude, and how we engage our spiritual, religious, and ethical identities with larger things that are going on in American
Great.
Culture.
Thank you. I think we're ready. We can take a couple more questions. Then I'm going to give a chance to our panelists to respond to each other as well. And if you have a question you'd like to pose to any of these people, then please identify that. And when I call on you, identify yourself. Stand up and say who you are. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Rabbi Jeff Faust from Bentley University, part of our Spiritual Life Center. I think the questions and the issues today are wonderful, the way we're raising issues. And we're also raising the question about what's working, not working, best practices. And so so I'd like to turn it back then to ask the question. We're also involved with the ISYC, and I know you're talking about different academic studies and different groups. A lot of people here are involved in these efforts. So I'd like to put it back in terms of the sharing, what's happening on research and sharing about what's working and not working.
Yeah, let's get a handful of those questions, because that's an important one. We're all going to want to weigh in on that. What's working, what's not working? Yes, in the back with your hand up.
Hello, my name is Nirubin. I'm an alum from the Kennedy School, and I work for the World Bank over in Indonesia. I'm from LA. I actually just flew in from Indonesia on Friday because I just wanted to make sure to make it to this event and some other things I have to do down here. But one of the questions I have is, so I took a divinity school course, the Transformational Leadership and Spiritual Development course, about 2 semesters ago. And this was before I graduated, and one of the problems I'm still grappling with over in Indonesia is for someone like myself who has no background in interfaith leadership whatsoever, but who's trying to at least help solve the problem of Jewish-Islamic relations in the largest Islamic country in the world, 4th largest country in the world, G20 economy, but who really doesn't have the tools, let alone the social support within the country. So I know this is a fairly broad question, but at least a sort of 101 or tips on even just starting these types of processes would be somewhat helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. We may have some people who can give you a few tips there. Yes.
My name is Sadia Baloch. Is this on?
You need to turn the switch on.
My name is Sadia Baloch, and as a volunteer, I'm the outreach coordinator at the Islamic Center of Boston in Wayland, Mass. And one word that hasn't come up, I'm also part of the Daughters of Abraham, and I know Jenny through that. One word that hasn't come up is reciprocality or reciprocating. And I think, especially for those of us who are in small minority communities, we also have to learn to reciprocate. And I wanted to say that on December 11th, 2016, there was another very large interfaith gathering that happened in Wayland, outside our mosque, where 1,000 people showed up in support of our mosque because we had gotten a hate letter a week before that. 1,000 people from the surrounding communities. It was absolutely amazing. But it taught us to think about what would happen if this happened across the street at the temple or at the church down the street. Would we show up with that much fervor? And it's something that we have to learn because we love getting, support, but the smaller communities, I think, are going to have to learn to reciprocate to keep things going.
Thank you.
We actually have a question from online, so we've been streaming and taking questions on Facebook, so I'll add one of those here. This comes from, someone named Stephen Andrew, who asks, how does the panel view ministries like chaplaincy, which are pluralistic by nature? What is the value of people of different beliefs coming together to care for one another, and what challenges and obstacles present themselves in this work?
Are we ready to have a few... whoops. Someone else is online here, but has no caller ID. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think so. Would any of you like to take one of those questions or more? Yeah, Jenny, stand up when...
I'll weave a few thoughts together. Is this on? Is this working? Yeah. Those are all really great questions. I want to start with Sadia's point about reciprocation. I think there is, when it comes to interfaith organizing, as our participant from Indonesia asked, I think one of the key principles is this issue of parity, reciprocation, looking for mutual motivation, saying, what is this to me? What is this work? Why does it matter? And finding partners in other communities that have a similar concern. So sort of a healthy, thriving community life is of interest to all of us. So where are the folks from various traditions who want to create coalitions built from the beginning on this principle of parity and mutual respect to co-create the initiative? I think this is a key aspect in any interfaith organizing. It's very different to say, would you like to come and join my initiative to save the world, versus what is of concern to you and to me, and I'd like to create a relationship out of which we might address this in creative ways. It's just a really different initiative, and to be open to both participating in and promoting various initiatives, I think, is part of the kind of flexibility you need to have as someone who's doing this work. The one other thing I will say about the what's working, depending on what you're asking about, and I'm going to answer that in just a few words from my interest in institutional change. So institutions change very slowly. And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes we give institutions a bad rap. I think by their nature, they're intended to be conservative in the best sense of the word, to conserve what's of value. So it's valuable that they change slowly. So trying to promote some change in how we study religion or think about the study of religion is really what I believe this interreligious or interfaith studies initiative is about, is trying to create a little space in the midst of something that we're already doing to ask these questions about the places where we intersect and interact. Those questions just don't get automatically asked. If you go into a PhD program in Jewish studies or in Islamic studies, you're not necessarily honing in on those moments of interaction. And we feel like there's a lot of need and a lot of value to carving out a little more space where those intersectional moments from multiple kinds of ways of thinking of that word get the first level of attention. We think that's something that would be of value. So I'll hand it off to my colleagues, but I wanted to make a few points. Thanks.
Yeah, you should have a pretty good pulse on what's working and what's not.
Is this piped in?
You can take that one.
Is this piped in?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So I think the answer to the question, what's working, is what do you want to achieve, right? And I think is actually if we were to do an exercise where, there's maybe 100 people here, if everybody had 5 minutes to privately write down on a slip of paper what they hope interfaith cooperation achieves, be interesting to see the overlap in those slips of paper, right? And my sense is that we are at a moment, this chapter of interfaith work is young. Interfaith work has existed in the United States since before this country was a nation, right? Since Roger Williams and the Flushing Remonstrance, and those are European settlers. Interfaith work existed before they were here too, right? But this chapter is relatively young. And I think part of what characterizes this is it's a definitional moment. So, it's what was it the Cheshire Cat said in Alice in Wonderland? If you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there, right? I mean, one of the reasons for the proliferation, the motley medley of methodologies in interfaith work, from interpretive dance, which Jenny and I have unfortunately participated in too many in our 20-year interfaith friendship, to theological discussion, is there isn't broad agreement on what this work is supposed to achieve. So here is a definition of that, right? Interfaith work is meant to achieve 5 civic goods. It is meant to reduce prejudice and increase understanding. It's meant to multiply social capital, recognizing that faith communities are significant sources of social capital, at least in the United States and likely in other societies around the world, although I know the United States best. It's meant to strengthen social cohesion. It's meant to support the continuity of identity groups, which is to say that interfaith work is meant to, and thank you for Diana's pioneering work on this, strengthen Methodist identity, not dilute it. And it is meant to help thicken the narrative that binds together a diverse society. So those are, I think, the 5 things interfaith work is seeking to achieve. Then the next question then becomes easier. What strategies and methodologies do you employ in a variety of program formats that helps achieve one or more of these 5 civic goods, right? One of the things that, I'm able to rat-a-tat that because it's a chapter in my book, Interfaith Leadership, and I worked really hard to get to those, so I might as well memorize them, right? One of the things that I think is important about this is that you can do that within the pro-life march, and you can do that between the pro-life march and the Atlanta ILI, right? So in other words, it can work within ideological communities, so to speak, and it also works across them, right? I think it's especially important across them. And one of the ways that I realize this is, these last couple of years has been both very difficult as an American Muslim, but also as, an upper middle class person who's graduate school educated. That's another really important identity category that I occupy that I don't talk about very much, right? My first book is entitled Upper Middle Class Professional, writes about, being upper middle class and all of the educational bias that I have, right? But I realized that in the course of the Trump campaign, as in I'm sitting around with all of my friends from different racial and religious backgrounds, and we are congratulating ourselves on how diverse we are, I have this kind of moment where I'm like, in the top 20 issues of American life, we agree on everything. So how diverse are we, right? Like, we have a common definition of justice, so common that we use the word justice without defining it ever. Ever. We just invoke it as if it's like the color red. Isn't it obvious? But there's a whole swath of my nation who has a different definitions of justice. I think interfaith cooperation is about increasing social capital between my crew and that crew, strengthening social cohesion, reducing prejudice. What's the narrative of a diverse society in which they feel like they can thrive? You know, my kids have never even heard of a Cracker Barrel, right? They walk into a grocery store in rural America and they see whole watermelons. They don't know what they are because Whole Foods only got chopped up watermelons. I'm not even kidding, right? Like, I am not interested in increasing their distance from Cracker Barrel America. I'm interested in strengthening that social cohesion.
Or do you have a response to any of these things you'd like to share with us? Yeah.
No. I'll add just a few footnotes because I mostly agree with Ibu and Jenny's responses. One other word which I'd like to include in the conversation is power. And I think it was embedded in both of the previous comments. And that needs to be explored in a number of different ways, including who is at the table and why are they at the table and who do they represent. So, one example of cracking open that question without knowing a lot about your context is, what is your sphere of influence and sphere of power? And it's something that Ibu and I have talked about a lot over the years. Where can you make a difference? And with whom can you make a difference? And I would also add to that you should think about winnable achievements from the world of community organizing and Saul Alinsky, because the work is hard and ongoing. And so as you think about why you are doing what you're doing, as Ibu said, and how you're going to do it, also thinking strategically about what is step 1, step 2, step 3, where is this leading us, and how do we gain momentum? Momentum in different ways. That is, if you start with 3 fairly like-minded people, one of your aims might be that you broaden the conversation, even if in some ways, externally, right, they appear to be different, etc. But that's an important term. And it goes hand in hand, of course, with another term that's been bandied about, which is intersectionality. Again, who is at the table? Who do they represent? Who is not there? And why is that so? Because we live in a world of tensions, I would also say you need to start where you are. And again, here, Ibu, you've been very helpful when you've said in the past, singing the song of the choir that is present and singing it repeatedly is important, because those are the people that are already committed, and they need to be tended to, and they need support. And we need together uplift, even as you're trying to reach out and broaden the conversation and the activities. But you want to begin with a core of people that are, of the willing. Another comment that I would make vis-a-vis what is working, and here I'll just speak about the sphere which I know best, which is in the training of religious leaders and specifically of Jewish leaders. 15 to 20 years ago, there were very few places where rabbis, cantors, educators were being offered various kinds of educational opportunities, whether formal or co-curricular, to engage in these questions. And now at virtually every one of the major Jewish seminaries in the United States, there's some form of interreligious or interfaith or multi-faith activity. And I'm looking at some of the older rabbis in the room who are nodding their heads. And one of the things that I want to say too regarding this is that, some of my great heroes and sheroes are people like Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruth Messenger and Diana Eck, all doing this work, by the way, in different ways. And so as we're working on definitions, I would also add, let's not flatten the discourse or the imaginal horizon in which people are doing this important work. But none of these people had formal training in interreligious dialogue, activism, organizing, etc. And so I feel passionate about what Jenny described as institutionalizing this kind of work. It can't be left either to nuts like us or virtuosos like the people I mentioned, who, because of their daring, compassionate spirits, are going to cross boundaries that most other people will not cross. And of late, I've been studying the work of one of my beloved and much lamented teachers, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. And I don't know how he worked up the gumption in 1962 to seek out Thomas Merton and to make pilgrimage, as he understood it, in biblical and rabbinic terms, to Gethsemane in order to pray and dialogue with the older Merton. Most people are not going to do that. So how now, as we develop this iteration of a field, do we learn from those experiments and our own experiments, which is why I chose my own experience to share with you, and think about how you weave that into the fabric of religious educational leadership, in my case, or civic leadership in the work that others do here.
Thank you, Or. I want to respond just for a moment to the gentleman who asked the question about Indonesia, because actually there are some pockets of people in Indonesia. Indonesia has its own motto of sort of coming together as one. Forget exactly how it's. Yes, there you go. And it is, it's a very multiple, vastly multiple society. There are academic centers like our own at Yogyakarta that are trying to take up this question of how we think about interreligious relations in that context where Islam is so enormously powerful, and in which other religious traditions, even if you're thinking constitutionally, are scarcely accorded rights. And there is the Center for Islam and Pluralism too. These are not vastly known places, and yet they reach out to us, to those of us who are doing this kind of work elsewhere. We haven't actually got to our online question about chaplaincies, but it is certainly true. And both Jenny and Or have raised that. You might think about that so our online questioner doesn't get too discouraged. But the idea of an interfaith chaplaincy, every single hospital in the United States has you might say, an interfaith clientele, patient population, even service and medical population. And how do the people, Or talk about this for just a second, because I know you've had some good experience.
So in the spirit of relational conversation, I'm going to call on at least one or two of my colleagues who are in the audience who I know well enough to embarrass. So Greg McGonigal or Tiffany Steinwert, you are doing this work. You're in the trenches every day on college campuses. Can one or both of you share a few anecdotes, a few reflections? There are others in the room too, but you're the folks that I know well enough to pass you the baton in this moment.
Robin's here too. Yes. So I am in the spirit of what you have done, or I'm actually going to pass it. We have students from our multi-faith center. So I just want to contextualize this a little bit. Wellesley College in 1993 hosted a landmark conference called Education as Transformation, where we were beginning to really set the landscape or set the table in a new way in higher education for doing multi-faith chaplaincy. So in higher education, traditionally in the United States, Christian organizations, colleges and university had a Protestant dominant model. By the 1980s, we knew that that was deeply flawed. We knew that a long time ago, but it was only by the 1980s that people started doing that. And in 1993, this conference that was supposed to bring maybe a couple hundred people brought 800. And if you know Wellesley's campus, that was very hard. We did not have an indoor space. We still don't have an indoor space big enough for 800 people. And so we took it outside to the lawns. And so I'm going to invite one of my students to talk about what multi-faith chaplaincy has looked like for them. And Chloe, can I ask you, because you've been on multi-faith council for 3 years?
Sure. Okay. Okay, thank you. I just want to clarify what we mean by multi-faith chaplaincy. This is like just having chaplains of multiple faiths at a college, yes? Yeah? Okay. So just double checking. Okay. I've been on the Multi-Faith Council for 3 years now. It is my favorite thing about Wellesley College. I come from an LDS background, Mormon for those who aren't familiar, and I grew up in a mostly Mormon community, so I didn't know a lot about any religions, really. Coming to Wellesley and being a part of the Multi-Faith Council, I've had the chance to talk to a lot of the different chaplains and interact with students of incredibly diverse religious traditions. It's meant a lot to me because I've been able to talk around about the beliefs of all of these different faiths and see how they parallel mine and how they might be different, and basically be able to find those commonalities and really connect with students. It's just been a really great learning experience. Yeah, I don't know. Okay.
Hi, I'm Greg McGonigal from Tufts University. I will just add, just very briefly, that I think one of the most important things for us to remember today is that college and university students are always changing, and so I sort of grew up with one iteration of interfaith work on college campus at Brown, where my great mentor Janet Cooper Nelson was, forming a multi-faith council, bringing together groups that we just kind of became aware of one another, that, there was an MSA and there was a Hindu Students Council and so forth, but people weren't really talking with one another in a formal way, and so we brought together an interfaith council. So that, that's now 20 years ago. But students coming to campus today, many of them have grown up with an interfaith reality, have grown up as religious minorities in the United States, numerically speaking. Many college students come without any formal religious or philosophical background at all, and so many are exploring, but we find that there's a tremendous openness to that exploration among our students, and so we just try, as a group of chaplains, and then working really importantly with our Interfaith Student Council of leaders, to develop many different kinds of entrance points. We start actually in the summer before students come to Tufts. We have an opportunity for incoming students to make their first experience of Tufts, a week-long program of visiting different religious and philosophical centers. We teach about the Pluralism Project. We introduce Interfaith Youth Corps, and this is the very introduction of our first years. We also meet some amazing first years through that who go on to become leaders in interfaith work and activism of all different kinds throughout their years. So there are many different forms, and I think those of us who do this will be happy to talk with people who are interested.
Just wanted to add one comment, and then others can chime in. But this year, with the help of several people, including Tiffany and Greg and Alex, through the Miller Center at Hebrew College, we launched an initiative called Billy. And it's an undergraduate program, 2 representatives from each school. There are 5 that are involved. They're planning a retreat at the end of the year. And one of the most powerful sentiments that was shared, I forget by which student from which school, was that chaplains and religious and spiritual and philosophical professionals from other religious traditions or spiritual traditions, you'll forgive the slippage in my nomenclature, had become significant mentors to them. And I thought that was a very important and powerful expression of the ways in which people across religious, spiritual, philosophical communities were finding one another, and for alchemic reasons were drawn to this person or to that one, whether or not they shared theological, ritual, or other things in common. But because there now is an infrastructure and there are opportunities to meet, to hear that from more than one student. But one student talked about the fact that she was from one tradition, and the most significant mentor that she had on campus was someone from your staffs who comes from a different community.
I'm Robin Olson from Bentley University, and I'll make a couple comments of areas that haven't been touched upon. And one is Bentley is a business school, so the undergraduates and the graduates are all already at that age self-selecting for business, which makes them a little more conventional than the other campuses that I have served, more liberal arts campuses. And it's a finance and accounting specialty school, which are not my areas of expertise as a United Methodist pastor. So it was very intimidating for me at first, and I wondered what is the role for interfaith cooperation on this campus. And oh my goodness, if we could take the vision and the passion of the students I served at Boston University in the School of Theology and connect that with the managerial and social enterprise skills of my Bentley students, we would rule the world. There is just so much in this unique connection that we're discovering. And then quickly, the second thing I want to say is that on my campus, 40% of the students do not identify with a religious tradition at all. And I was told, well, so I guess you'll kind of hang out with those 60%. The founder of my faith, John Wesley, said, "The world is my parish." And so the entire campus is my parish. So there are 4 of us here from Bentley, we've had a lot of fun reaching out very specifically to include, like who's at the table? The secular humanists, the folks who do not identify with any tradition, with some really, really needed practices of mindfulness. And on this Bentley campus, where there aren't a lot of opportunities for creativity, we have been able to establish art and soul, and that's wildly popular and draws so many people who wouldn't have crossed the threshold into our sacred space. So we're having a lot of fun. Thanks.
To raise the question for a moment about where this table is, because there are lots and lots of tables. Some of them are actual tables, some of them are classrooms, some of them are city councils, some of them are the tables that take place within religious communities. And I think one of the things that I really resonate with in the challenge that Ibu has put to us is, how do we think about, we who are really interested in making this what I sometimes call the interfaith infrastructure that we really need in our cities and towns and college campuses. How do we do this when some of the people whose sort of tables of interest are quite different? I mean, for example, we all know the fact that it's been very difficult in some circles to get people who are very conservative in their theological positions, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, get them to participate because it seems that somehow in the joining together with people of other faith traditions, there is a challenge or there is a relativism that is either threatening or they're just not interested in. So how do you get the interfaith conglomeration that is involved in pro-life? Actually, that could include quite a lot of Muslims as well, as it did in one of the Cairo conference on development maybe 20 years ago. I mean, there were Muslims and many Christian communities that were involved in trying to deal with issues of birth control and abortion, et cetera. This is a hard call, and how do you imagine these conversations where people who identify differently around religion, but have some common concern, how do we get them together? And Jenny,
Yeah.
you have the mic, and I'm sure you have ideas as
Well-
well, and Ibu as well.
I kind of want to add a little data to your query, because I think, well, the answer to that for me, the first answer is to notice your own blind spots. So when Orr asked about who's at the table and who's not at the table, who are you not even asking about? Because for me, that growth process has been essential in trying to crack this question a little. I was actually at an interfaith gathering for IFYC in Chicago back in like 2014. I don't know if you remember this, Ibu, but we were all talking about all the issues that we were going to confront together, and there was this great energy about solving problems, and if only the fundamentalists would get out of the way and let us solve all these problems. And we found, like, the fundamentalists kept coming up as the folks who were blocking all the potential good work. And then this guy stood up, and he couldn't have been more than 17 or 18 years old, and he was like, "Hi, my name's John, and I'm a fundamentalist." And he was so sweet and sincere, and rather than saying, "I can't believe how all of you have been talking about me and the folks I love," he said, "I want to know how I can get more of the folks that I know here to these kinds of gatherings." So that was my first little like, okay, Jen, think about your blind spots here. And the second one is on the opposite end of the spectrum. I find at many interreligious gatherings, and particularly those framed around the Abrahamic faiths, tend to devolve into a kind of narrative of us religious people and those secular people. And, you know, we might not agree on everything, but at least we're all people of the book, you know, and there's some kind of clarity about that. And so that's another serious blind spot and a big learning curve for me when I started at Andover Newton, a Christian seminary, was to find all the amazing allies in the secular humanist atheist communities who were as concerned, convicted, curious about the social ills facing our communities and how to use their ethical commitments to address those issues, along with folks from religious communities who they knew shared a lot of the concerns that they had. So I think number one is try to notice your own blind spots, try to get folks who love you, they're good at pointing them out, and then try to think about how the way you're framing the issue or the question either invites or inhibits the participation of that wider gathering of who we are. So.
By saying that I had a handful of half-formed thoughts. I was up at 4 a.m. I wish it was for Fajr prayer, but it was for a flight, and I think that I'm at about a 10% formed thought right now, so hang with me. So I'm going to try to put two things in conversation here, right? One is, what's the relationship between interfaith activity and interfaith studies as a scholarly field? And the very smart professors who are very skeptical of interfaith studies would say what Benjamin is doing, what the folks at Wellesley are doing, that's great, but you don't need a field of study to have student roundtables on interfaith and gratitude. It's not bad to have a faculty member there who, you know, knows religious scripts in 4 languages to enrich the discussion, but you don't need to have an academic field on that, right? I think that that's legit. Right? So, do you need an academic field, right? Would a field of study that sought to have a relationship with practice, if you will, make the practice better, right? What could be some analogies for this? I mean, I opened up by saying public health, education, all of these are spheres that at some point in human history were done with relatively little institutional organization. They were done informally, right? Person X is sick. Here's a couple of kind of homebrewed remedies, right? Over the course of time, These were done with increasing institutional sophistication, and fields of studies emerged in large part to improve said engagement, right? With a variety of benefits and some costs. Are we at that point in interfaith work yet, right? Which is to say, is it like public health? Is it, which is, you can, if you take, for example, a particular cholera epidemic in Bangladesh that Atul Gawande talks about, you can know an awful lot about the disease that is cholera, an awful lot about the body, but have and you can even know what the cure is, but not have any idea how to encourage a population to avail itself of the treatment. Right, so there's probably different fields that focus on, biology probably focuses on a dimension of this. Epidemiology focuses on another dimension of this. Part of what public health as a field is about, the folks here at the Harvard School of Public Health, they study and they teach about if there is a cholera epidemic in a population, how do you get that population to avail itself of the treatment in a variety of different kinds of settings, right? Is there an analogy to be made to interfaith work? And, of course, one of the questions is, in the cholera epidemic, the stakes are really clear. What are the stakes in our work? Are they worthy of a field, right? Are they worthy of a field? So that would, Dean Hempton left before I asked him if he would assign a budget to this field. Maybe a tenure-track professorship. But if somebody sees him, ask him that, right? Right? Look, there wasn't always a field called comparative religions. There wasn't always a center for the study of world religions. Sometime in history, somebody was like, hey, this thing matters. And it matters because it is an important area of study, and also it will help us do a set of things better, and there are high stakes around those things. Can we articulate that for our work, right? So here's my second, the second area here is, Jenny, to just thicken the story you told, that the person that young man was responding to was Rabbi David Saperstein, who's a major dude in our world, right? And at that time, he was serving as ambassador of religious freedom in the State Department. So he had a really senior position, right? And this was a 14-year-old high school student, right? He was like a 14-year-old high school student. And here's what's interesting to me. Our language was, how do we get the quote-unquote fundamentalists involved, right? So I was in Utah a few years ago, and I gave a talk outside of Provo and a talk in Logan. And at both places, the audience was like 1,000 people, right? Yes, right? And I'm like, this is unbelievable. Like, LDS folks show. And somebody was like, oh, you should have seen how many people were here when Robert George came to speak. It's a conservative Catholic intellectual from Harvard, right? And it occurred to me, Robert George comes to speak about his view of same-sex marriage, which is shared by no small part of the population in Utah, and like 5, 8, 10,000 people show up. And they're asking, how do we get the progressive Muslims involved? Right? I mean, part of what I find almost hilarious about the way we talk is as if we have the majority room, right? As if like there's this handful of people out there that we want to bring in, like, and it's like there are 1,000 people, Mormons, Catholics, and evangelicals, at the pro-life march for every one person involved in progressive interfaith work. By massive numbers, that is the larger interfaith field. By massive numbers, right? And if you think about the Peel Conference and John F. Kennedy in 1960, if you think about the United States government fighting a quasi-war against the LDS Church 110 years ago, if you think about the LDS community viewing itself as an alternative ecclesiology to the Catholic Church, it is stunning to think that this is a political kinship group. In other words, the lines of difference that set crosses is massive, right? And one can trace this through history. One can trace a moment of deep schism and then a moment of kinship. That's fascinating, right? One can count the numbers. So I wonder, what do we do with this? And I am just not sure that the best answer is, if I was just better at convincing you about my ideology, you would come to my table. I'm just not sure that's the best answer, right? Or son is one of the top 100 hockey players in New England, right? And one of the things I love, you get it from his dad. I think, and Orr and I will talk about this. We're very good friends, and he'll say, "Look, I spent weekend days with guys who own used car lots and are proud Trump voters. Can't imagine why anybody wouldn't be. And my 12-year-old is passing them the puck for hat tricks." I honestly think America is built on that. America is built on the civic associations that bring progressive rabbis who advance healthcare for all together with Trump voting used car dealer owners to say, what matters most here is hockey. And I don't know what side of the picket line you're on, right? But whatever side of the picket line you're on, I will not let that cancel out us forming this hockey league together. And maybe hockey's not your thing. So how about hospitals, right? Imagine this scenario. Heart surgeon walks into a 2-person heart surgery, sees her fellow heart surgeon putting away his road gear, dressing into the scrubs, and sees a Make America Great hat. She says, "I can't perform heart surgery with you. I just can't do it." How do you have a diverse democracy unless people are able to disagree on some fundamental things and work together on other fundamental things? And part of what I want to posit about interfaith work is it's not centrally about getting people who I ideologically disagree with into a more progressive tent, proud as I am about being in that tent. It is centrally about creating a form of civic health that allows people of different ideologies, principally ones whose ideologies are based on religious identity, to continue to be able to do things together. That was a 20% thought.
Or did you want to respond a little bit or add to this? And we have another couple of questions. Yep.
I'll try and be brief, which is not easy for me. The first thing that I would say is that within my sphere of work, which is primarily the training of rabbis and religious leaders, it is clear to me that there has to be a shift, and that we need to analyze, as I said before, best practices. And so one of the questions that we're facing now at Hebrew College is how to introduce courses on Christianity and Islam, and what are the best ways of doing that? That is, how much time should our students dedicate to learning about classical sources or contemporary trends, knowing that they're already engaged in a very intensive learning process. But we just feel like they cannot become rabbis without knowing something about Christianity and Islam. And it's not exclusively about creating an Abrahamic club, but given the very complicated histories of these three traditions, and given the stakes in terms of the possibilities for peace building among these traditions, that is where we're choosing to start. But even that is a complicated question. How do you do that best? And it's something that several of you in the room have been helpful with over the years about how to convey in the most beneficial ways what these religious leaders will and should know. The other point that I want to raise, since Ibu was kind enough to invoke my son's hockey cred, is that in my experience in situations like this and others, in building relationships which are authentic, there also come moments where there are impasses or there is a need to disrupt narratives. And that's complicated and sometimes painful. And you have to think wisely about how to do that and expect that people are going to do the same with you. And so, I can say that 3 or 4 times over the last 3 or 4 years, I've had to say to people, no, that is not what Jewish means. And using that term is insulting. And there may have been times where I said things about other groups, that also needed to be corrected. So, as you all know, it's not simply, warm and fuzzy. But in the context of real relationships, then you can say things that might be difficult in the moment, but lead you into a deeper place of authentic connection. And again, it doesn't need to necessarily dominate the activity and the reason for gathering, but there are opportunities for education and for growth. And I think we have to be courageous in those moments. It goes back to that statement about, dignity and diligence. And part of my diligence as a Jewish parent, as a rabbi, is to say, this is my understanding of my own identity, of the history and the values of my tradition and of my community. And if I've missed the mark on something about you and your community, then tell me.
I saw another question back there. Yes, please.
So I've been sitting here thinking about the ways in which Rabbi Orr mentioned intersectionality, brought that idea into the conference, and Jennifer talked about this blind spot, and we've all talked about this table and whatnot. And it got me thinking about especially Boston and looking around the room and knowing that we are relatively a collegiate environment, and if not, I don't know, you somehow were able to get here at 4 o'clock on a Monday, that kind of a thing. It got me thinking about the surrounding areas of Boston, like Dorchester, where, there's all kinds of people that probably want to be a part of the liberal interfaith movement, and that's my assumption. But I guess my question, and I'm a young person in the interfaith world, I didn't realize interfaith was actually such a young movement, so maybe this is coming in a longer time from now, but I guess I'm just wondering, how do we go about including more socioeconomic statuses into this, people who can't get to college, where this seems to be taking off, and don't have the luxury or the privilege to sit around and discuss these issues?
Question, just for asking one of the hardest ones last. And I wish we had some more response to that. I do think our schools, especially when you look at the demography of our schools in Boston, there is ample opportunity for leadership because the students come from every part of the world virtually, and from socioeconomic circumstances that are intersecting, and who don't have a great deal of knowledge of the backgrounds of the people with whom they go to school. We have a very active program at Harvard that has literally a large fraction of the student body involved in extracurricular work in the city of Boston. And some of it is after-school tutoring, some of it is in-school tutoring. Some of it is the development of the kinds of programs that we might really love. There are schools that have their E Pluribus Unum days here in Boston and its suburbs. So it's a big question and an important one. I want to draw our afternoon to a semi-close. And these discussions, I hope, will not close because they're so important. One of the things I love about Ibu is the fact that he is always there with the analogy, whether it's heart surgery or cholera or something else that gives us a sense of the ways in which we ourselves behave. And when I think about the challenges that we face in educational institutions, one of the sort of bon mots of educational institutions and others across the country these days is that oft-repeated phrase from administrators to HR people, diversity and inclusion. What does that mean, really? It means that this issue of diversity is on the map of institutions, of no matter what kind of institution, of educational institutions, of civic institutions, of service institutions, of the training of people institutions that almost never include religion in the form of diversity that they feel is worthy of diversity training. We all need to be thinking about that. I do think that as an educator, one of the things that is most important in education, and I would affirm all of these are good principles you laid out here of what should we want to do, reduce prejudice, build on social capital, the ways in which we create things together, social cohesion, strengthening identity, and thickening the narrative that binds us together. And the one place that I want to sort of complexify that wouldn't be news to Ibu or any of our other educators here, is that strengthening our identity also means the challenging of our identity. It means the self-reflection that is critically a part of what it means to go to college or to be educated, to be able to think about oneself in the presence of others. And it's one of the things that I love most about teaching is that specific opportunity to gather students together in small groups and have them come to know each other, the small group process, but also in and through that to reflect about themselves and really to make self-knowledge one of the banners of an educated person. The kind of ethical self-knowledge that comes from knowing people who come from a very different perspective or whose parents and grandparents came from a very different world. And that's the kind of academic world that most of us inhabit who are involved in colleges or universities, where the diversity is there, but the engagement and the opportunities for deliberately building self-reflection into the curriculum are few and far between, and indeed places where they're not so sure that students should be encouraged to reflect about their own experience as secular people, as religious people, from whatever background they come. And since I've taught that way for years and do encourage people to bring those elements of their multiple identities to the fore, I think that this is a moment when not only embracing the kind of interfaith studies that will help us look at the complexities of our world and address them in the ways that the public health people are looking at the complexities of a cholera epidemic, but also to build into our pedagogy the ways in which we know perfectly well that this kind of self-reflective teaching that is premised primarily on self-knowledge is absolutely critical. So I'm going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to have 2 last sentences And let me begin with you. 2 sentences.
You know, begin over there.
Okay, I'll begin over here.
Oh, gosh, I'm not sure I have 2 last sentences, other than to just say what a pleasure it's been to have this conversation. I've been gaining new ideas as we've been talking. I hope you all have been gaining new ideas as we've been talking. And I think that's the point of this kind of dialogue, not to sort of solve or answer any of these questions, but to get this lively exchange going. So just a note of gratitude to my fellow conversation partners. Thanks.
Give that to Orr.
Okay. Ditto?
Ditto.
I love it when he does that.
But he can't be ditto.
Right.
Go ahead.
So my two favorite lines about this kind of work these days is diversity is not just the differences you like, and diversity work isn't rocket science, it's harder.
That's right. For coming, and stay tuned to the work of all of these people, and let us know a little more about what you do. Thank you.
Fun that you were there, huh? Yeah. So at least you know.